Hello, everybody. I'm Jake, and this is MLS Fantasy Analyst. This is an introduction video for how to play MLS Fantasy. This will be the basics with a little bit of extra strategy in there, so if you're an MLS Fantasy veteran, send this to your friends and family that are new to the game, and also feel free to watch along and add any other tips you can think of down in the comment section. I genuinely love MLS Fantasy. It makes it so fun to watch the games, especially the games where you usually wouldn't know who to cheer for, but you've got somebody on your field that you're hoping that does well. So it makes it so much fun to watch. And this league is different than any other sports league, and I like it a lot better. First of all, it's a salary cap league. Each player costs a certain amount of money depending on their perceived potential for points. There are an unlimited amount of trades. You can swap as many players you want after each game starts up to the start of each player's game, as long as you are under the salary cap. You and other people in your group can use the same players at the same time. It's not like other leagues where only one person can have each player. Points. Players will score you points depending on how well they do in real life. How you get points. So this is on the MLS Fantasy website under How to Play. So if you want to read through all of these, you're welcome to. I'm not going to go through every single one in this video, but in general, the big points that you're going to get, if you're a goalie, you get big points. Obviously, if you scored a goal as a goalie, that'd be incredible. I think you should get like 20 points for that, but you get 6 points if you score a goal as a goalie, and you get 5 points for a clean sheet. Defenders are similar. They get 6 points if they score a goal and 5 points for a clean sheet. 3 points for an assist for everybody. Midfielders, the big ones are 3 points for the assist and 5 points for a goal. And forwards, same thing, 3 points for assist, 5 points for a goal. And everybody gets a point if they play even 1 minute. And if you play over 60 minutes, you end up with 2 points. And then you can lose points by missing a penalty, having an own goal, yellow cards, red cards, committing too many fouls, etc. Player value. You start out with 100 mil in your salary as your salary cap. As you can see, Roman Celentano here, it's worth 6.5 mil. Justin Gladys worth 6 mil. I think my most expensive is Lucho Costa at 9 mil and Cucho Hernandez at 9 mil. Every player is going to increase or decrease depending on how they perform. When your players play, they receive both points and a value increase or decrease. The maximum value increase or decrease is $500,000 either way. Your salary cap will increase or decrease exactly as much as your players collectively increased or decreased. For example, if you start with 100 mil and your players collectively increased 3 mil, then your salary cap next week will be 103 mil. Early on, you won't be able to pick all the best players that you want, so it's important to gain salary cap by your players playing well so that you can continue to get better players in later weeks. Players gain or lose value depending on not only this week's performance, but recent performances as well. So if a player went up $500,000 last week, they're likely to continue increasing even when they only have a mediocre game this week. And you'll be able to see on these stats, if you click on the player, you'll be able to see their stats. You'll be able to see their average points or total points. This is still from last year. Their rank from last year, who they're all owned by, projected score for this week. And you'll be able to see how much they've gone up this season and how much they went up last week. And this is a really important one. If you see that they've gone up $500,000 last week, then it's probably a good player to pick because they're likely to continue to go up because it uses past performance as well as the current performance. Single game weeks and double game weeks. This is a weekly game, so you have at least a couple of days to make your picks every week. If you don't change your picks, you'll just keep the players that you picked last week. Each team will either have a single game week or a double game week. For example, this week, Inter Miami and Real Salt Lake have double game weeks. You'll see right here, there's 2 games right here, but Cincinnati only has 1 game, so they have a single game week. On double game weeks, you get points from both games, so it's almost always important to pick double game week players if there are any. Monetary value of players changes by week, but not by game. So a double game week player will be assessed on both games before being increased or decreased. Double game weeks do not provide double the value increase or decrease. Value changes only at the end of the game week and will only ever change by $500,000, double game week or not. So for double game weeks, you do get the points from both games, but their value only goes up by $500,000 or down $500,000, depending on how they played in those 2 games. Lineups. You will pick 15 players, 11 for the field, and 4 for your substitute bench. You will be picking 2 goalies, 1 starter goalie and 1 substitute goalie, 5 defenders, 5 midfielders, and 3 forwards. You can only have 3 players from a single MLS team on your team. So, for example, I have 3 Inter Miami players. I couldn't have a 4th Inter Miami player. You can only play players in their designated position. So you couldn't play Julian Gressel as a forward. That has to go as a defender. You can play a variety of different formations, and I'll go over all those in a minute, the valid formations. But for example, this 4-4-2, you would have 1 defender, 1 midfielder, and 1 forward on the bench. Or I could play a 4-3-3, and you have a defender and 2 midfielders on the bench and no forwards on your bench. The reason that you have subs is if you have a player that doesn't play. For example, this player right here, he has a bye week, so he's not going to play at all. The game is going to choose the best player from your bench, and it's going to put him in for that scrub. And it's not just if you get 0 points. You could get 0 points and he still counts. But if he doesn't play at all, does not play 1 minute of the game, 1 second of the game, that's when you will get a substitute. Same with the goalie, but goalies can only sub for goalies. However, defenders could sub for a midfielder, for example, as long as it's a valid formation. And I'll go over valid formations here in just a minute. Locked out. As soon as a player game starts, or rather the time that it says that it's going to start, the player is locked and you can no longer change them. If the game is scheduled to start at 6, for example, then it locks out at 6. It doesn't matter if the game actually, the opening whistle actually goes at 6:15, or even if there's a weather delay and it doesn't start till 9, it locks out when it says the game starts. So it would these games are going to lock out at 6. And if there's a double game week, it locks out at the very first game. So you won't be able to switch in between games if it's a double game week. So it's important, if you want to do really, really well, to be checking lineups. Teams will put out their lineups on Twitter, or X, I guess. They will put out their lineups about 30 minutes to an hour before their game starts. So you want to be checking lineups to make sure that your players are starting. You almost never want to pick a player that isn't starting. If you look on the lineup and it shows that Cucho is on the bench, pick somebody else, because he is more likely than not going to get as many points as a starting player, even a starting player that isn't as good. Formations. There is a minimum amount of players that you need to have in each position. You need to have a minimum of 1 goalie and a maximum of 1 goalie, I guess. A minimum of 3 defenders, a minimum of 3 midfielders, and a minimum of 1 forward. So you can have, I'll put on the screen a list of the different formations you can have. There's 7 of them: a 3-5-2, 3-4-3, 4-5-1, 4-4-2, 4-3-3, 5-4-1, or a 5-3-2. Your exact formation will depend on which players you put on the bench and which you want on the field. For example, minimum of 3 midfielders you need to have. If you tried to sub on a forward and do a 5-2-3, it wouldn't let you, because you have to have a minimum of 3 midfielders. So that's what will happen if you try to do an invalid formation. And this is important to note, because say you did this formation and you have a midfielder who doesn't play. Let's say Diego Luna doesn't play. That means Bernard Camungo could not come on for Diego Luna as a sub, because that would create an invalid formation. So only one of these 2 players would be able to come on for Diego Luna. Captains. Captains are pretty straightforward. You pick your captain every week, and they get double the points. So if Julian Gressel got 5 points, and I chose him as my captain, I would get 10 points for him. You can't change your captain once their game has started. But if, for example, all these Miami games had already started and I had Lucho Acosta as my captain, then I could still move him to someone else. as long as his game hadn't started and the person I was trying to move it to's game hadn't started yet. Substitutes. So we've already gone over some substituting rules. Generally, as a pro tip here, you should put the players that you have a higher confidence in on the field because they're going to play no matter what, and the players that you have that are more variable, players that you have less confidence in, on the bench. And subs still count toward your salary cap. That's important to note, that your subs will still count toward your salary cap. So if Tim Parker has a terrible game and loses $500,000, goes down to 5.5 mil, that will affect your salary cap for next week, just like any other field player. The scrub strategy. Because of the way the rules work on subs, it creates a strategy that all high-level fantasy players use called the scrub strategy. Essentially, you put the cheapest player that you can find that you know is not going to play. For example, Levante Johnson here is not going to play because he has a bye week. This little blue dot means that he has a bye week. Because he's not going to play, one of these subs, in fact, the best performing sub, is going to sub on for this player. So it creates the strategy where you can have Tim Parker have a terrible game, Matthew Chouanier is going to have a terrible game, but Bernard Camundo has a great game. Then these two players' points aren't going to count toward your total, but the better player is going to count towards your total. In addition, if you pick substitutes that all play before some of the field players, then you can assess the performance of your subs and then decide how many scrubs you need to put on the field. For example, if you have your substitute goalie, if he plays at least 3 hours before your field goalie plays, then you can assess how well he does. If he gets 5 points, 5 or more points, then you can scrub this goalie and pick a goalie that isn't going to play and just take his points. Same thing with your field players. If 2 of these guys do really well, then you can scrub 2 players as long as it's a valid formation. You can scrub 2 of these players. If all 3 do well, you can scrub 3 players. If none of them do well, you can change this guy for a guy who's actually going to play. So it creates this win-win situation where you can feel out how 4 players do before any other players play, or at least before some other players play, and then you can decide how many scrubs to put on the field depending on how well your subs play. But you have to make sure that it's going to be a legal formation. For example, right now, if any of these 3 players did really well, if just one of them did well, any of them could sub on for my scrub because that's a valid formation. That's a valid formation. And that's a valid formation. If, for example, this is what I chose to do, and say Tim Parker does really well, I can't sub Tim Parker on for that scrub because that would create an invalid formation. You can't have 0 forwards. So make sure with your scrubs that it would create a valid formation if one of these players did well. So in this situation, if Tim Parker did really well, I would need to choose a scrub that was a midfielder or a defender. And just a side note, you can't scrub your captain and have one of these guys earn double points. It doesn't work. I've tried it. If Kamungo got 6 points and Lucho Acosta didn't play at all, Kamungo would still go on for Acosta, but he wouldn't get double the points. He wouldn't get the extra captain points. So make sure and look out for cheap players with bye weeks who are loaned out or are injured for your scrubs. And the worst thing that can happen is if you have a scrub that somehow makes it onto the field and gets you 1 point, for example, and then you've got some guy on the bench that got you 10 points that isn't going to come on. So make sure to check lineups and or make sure that your scrub has a bye or has a season-ending injury or something. Make sure that that player isn't going to come on, isn't on the substitute bench on the team roster. Now, leagues. There are two kinds of leagues, open leagues and head-to-head leagues. In open leagues, you will be rated on how many points your players get alone. It will just aggregate every week, and whoever has the most points at the end of the season wins. In head-to-head leagues, you will be pitted up against another player each week for whoever can get more points that week. The winner, whoever gets more points, gets 3 points, or if you get the same amount of points, you get 1 point for a tie or 0 points for the loss. And note, these are league points, totally different from fantasy points. Both of these types of leagues can be public or private. When you register for the first time, you will be asked what your favorite team is. Mine's Real Salt Lake, and you will be put in the Real Salt Lake official or St. Louis City official, or whatever team your favorite is. You'll be placed in that league. You will also be placed in the overall league, which is just everybody who signed up. And if your league has, I think, more than 50 players, definitely your team league and the overall league. If you do really well in a week or do really well in a season, there are different prizes that you can get, different like MLS store gift cards or cash prizes, that kind of thing, if you do really well in those leagues. So it's a good incentive to do well. You can create up to 5 leagues, but you can join as many leagues as you want. There is also a Champions League, MLS Fantasy Champions League. Essentially, the season is split up into 5 sections. There will be qualifiers for the first 4 sections. If you get in the top 50 overall in any of those sections, you get invited to this Champions League of the top 200 players, and then the winner of that will get a certain prize. Stats. There's a stats center that you can go to that you can sort by different things, who's owned by the most people. Obviously, Messi is owned by the most people, who got the most fantasy points. This is all last year's data. And you can also click on any player you want. It gives you some stats here, and you can click on full profile, and it'll give you their game-by-game breakdown, how many minutes they did, goals for, against, assists, clean sheet, etc. And some of my favorite stats are the 3-week average, their average for the last 3 weeks, and their average for the last 5 weeks, high score, low score, etc. I also keep some of my own stats that I started doing last year. Like, for example, I kept home average and away average. So if you want any of those stats, then watch some of my tier list videos that I send out. Navigating the website. So this is where you have your team. You can manage your team. This one will, you can't do it right now, but it'll show you your team points from last week and the dream team, meaning the best players from last week. This is where you can find your leagues. This is the stats center, shows the schedule. Fantasy news, they'll have each week, they'll have like positional rankings, like this is last year's for week 29. Those are always good to read. The nice how to play section that goes over pretty much everything I've gone over this video. And prizes. First place, $2,000. That's a pretty good prize. Then you've got this little section over here where you can search for players. You can search by position. You can search by club. You can search by minimum value, maximum value, available or unavailable. And you can sort by price, average, last 3 average, points per million, etc. And if you've made it this far in the video, you've definitely earned a couple tips. So early on in the season, you want to focus on trying to get as much salary as you can, as much salary cap. So even more so than points sometimes. So for example, if you find a player in a starting lineup that's only 4 mil, then they can only go up. They can't go down. So that might be a good player to put maybe on your bench or even on the field if you want to. But because that will help build your salary cap so that you can pick better players in later weeks, because by week 10, some people will be at 125 mil and some people will only be at 110 mil, and that makes a huge difference on what players you can pick. Another tip is, as you can tell from this stat here, this is the home average last year and the away average last year. As you can tell, players tend to play better at home. Ahmad almost got 11 points at home and less than 7 points away on average. And that trend continues down the entire line. So just in general, players play better at home, and especially defenders and goalies have a better chance of shutouts at home than they do away. So just something to keep in mind. You can definitely pick away players. I've definitely have picked away players, but players tend to play better at home. And my last tip is just to watch these tier list videos that I put out or any other videos that I put out. And there's plenty of other people that put out videos and other content that are great that you should also look into. You can follow me on Twitter/X. I'm just MLS Fantasy Analyst there. And yeah, you should also join my group, join my league. It's called MLS Fantasy Analyst Friends. If you want to join that league, we got about 19 people right now. We'd love to get that as high as we can. So feel free to join that league. It's open, it's free. That would be awesome. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate your time and happy picking.